The call came in at 7:42 Friday morning while I was standing in line at a coffee shop 3 miles from my old office. I looked at the screen. Darren Holt. My former boss. I almost let it ring out. Then I answered. The first thing I heard was a car door slam and somebody breathing too fast. "Claire," he said, already talking over himself, "where are the validation binders?" Not hello. Not good morning. Not even a fake apology. Just panic. Behind him, I could hear another voice. Male. Sharp. Tell her we have 20 minutes. I checked the time again. 7:42 a.m. The FDA inspection at Norvale Biologics was scheduled for 8 o'clock. And they had fired me at 4:16 the afternoon before. "I'm sorry," I said. "Who is this?" Silence. Then Darren exhaled hard through his nose. "Claire, this isn't the time." No, it really wasn't. I stepped out of line while the barista called somebody else's order. The morning air smelled like wet pavement and burnt espresso. "Yesterday," I said, "you informed me my position had been eliminated as part of a cost optimization initiative. So I'm confused why you're calling my personal number during an active federal inspection." Another pause. In the background, someone muttered, "Jesus Christ." That was when I knew exactly how bad things were. My name is Claire Bennett. I was 46 years old when Norvale Biologics decided 17 years of institutional knowledge was too expensive to keep on payroll. My official title was Senior Director of Regulatory Compliance and Validation Operations, which sounds inflated until you realize I was personally responsible for keeping 3 manufacturing facilities inspection-ready under FDA and EMA standards. I joined Norvale in 2008 when they occupied one building outside Newark and produced exactly 2 injectable products. By the time they fired me, annual revenue had climbed from $84 million to $1.3 billion. I built most of the compliance infrastructure that made that growth possible. Not alone, obviously. Nobody builds pharmaceutical systems alone. But I designed the validation tracking architecture they still used. I created the deviation escalation protocol that reduced audit findings by 63% in 4 years. I negotiated the digital archival conversion that saved the company $2.8 million annually in storage and retrieval costs. Most importantly, I built the MVRS platform, Master Validation Record System. Not glamorous, just critical. Every controlled process at Norvale flowed through MVRS. Equipment qualifications, batch validations, environmental monitoring records, sterility certifications, change controls, training acknowledgments. Every audit trail the FDA could legally request during an inspection. People outside pharma think audits are about cleanliness. They aren't. They're about documentation. If you can't prove something happened exactly the way you claim it happened, then legally, it may as well never have happened at all. That's what MVRS did. It proved everything. And, because I had designed the credential hierarchy after a contractor breach back in 2017, master-level authorization access required dual authentication tied to individual licensing approvals. Mine included. At the time, leadership praised the security measures. Darren called it Claire's Fort Knox phase during a quarterly town hall. Everybody laughed. I remember because I stayed until midnight 3 nights that week finalizing those controls while my husband ate dinner alone. Again. That happened a lot. There was the Thanksgiving I spent in conference room B reviewing deviation reports after a refrigeration excursion threatened an entire pediatric oncology batch worth $11 million. There was the year I slept on a folding cot in my office during a snowstorm because a sterilization cycle failed and somebody had to oversee the revalidation sequence in person. My daughter used to joke that she recognized my laptop case faster than my face. Kids are funny like that. Brutal. But funny. Still, I stayed. Because I believed competence mattered. I believed if you made yourself indispensable enough, eventually people respected it. That was probably my only real mistake. The first sign things were changing came in February when the CEO's nephew arrived. Ethan Mercer. 32 years old. MBA from somewhere he mentioned constantly. Haircut that looked aggressively expensive. Shoes too polished for a manufacturing environment. He introduced himself during the Monday operations meeting by saying, I'm here to help modernize procedural efficiencies. Nobody knew what that meant, including Ethan, as far as I could tell. Darren brought him into the conference room smiling like he'd recruited a war hero. Everybody, Darren announced, this is Ethan Mercer, our new Associate Director of Strategic Quality Integration. I'd worked in pharmaceutical compliance for nearly 2 decades. That wasn't a real job title. You could tell the room noticed too, because Monica Reyes glanced down at her notebook immediately to hide her expression. Monica managed quality systems. Smart woman. Terrible poker face. Ethan sat beside Darren and immediately opened the wrong quarterly report. Not metaphorically. Literally the wrong report. He spent 5 straight minutes discussing packaging metrics from an outdated distribution file before Omar Patel finally interrupted carefully. I think you're looking at logistics, not validation. Ethan blinked at the screen. Right. Correct. Cross-functional overlap. There was no overlap. After the meeting, Monica caught up with me near the elevators. Strategic quality integration, she whispered. I think they assembled it from random LinkedIn words, I said. She laughed so hard she snorted once, then looked horrified at herself. That was Ethan's first week. By week 3, he started explaining compliance procedures to people who wrote them, including me. One afternoon, he walked into my office holding a printed deviation packet upside down. Upside down. I reviewed the CAPA trajectory, he said confidently. CAPA. Corrective and preventive action. Everybody in pharma knows the acronym. Nobody says trajectory. The current optics feel overly granular. I looked at him for a moment. It's a contamination investigation. Right, but perception matters. No, I said calmly. Sterility matters. He smiled the way inexperienced men smile at competent women they've already decided are difficult. You're very process-oriented. Yes, I said. It's pharmaceuticals. That smile disappeared briefly. Tiny moment. But I noticed it. People always tell you exactly who they are in those little moments. Ethan developed a habit after that. He'd repeat things I said in meetings 10 minutes later using worse terminology, then look around the room expecting admiration. Sometimes Darren gave it to him. We need tighter deviation response timing, I'd say. Then Ethan would lean back and announce exactly. Agile compliance velocity. And Darren would nod like he'd just heard Warren Buffett explain investing. The truly dangerous people in corporations are never the loud idiots. Everybody sees those coming. It's the mediocre men protected by powerful relatives. The ones who fail upward because nobody wants to embarrass the executive family tree. By June, Ethan was attending FDA prep meetings despite clearly not understanding inspection sequencing. In July, Darren assigned him partial oversight of validation review. In August, Ethan accidentally approved a draft protocol containing expired calibration references. That mistake could have triggered a formal observation during inspection. Monica caught it at 9:30 p.m. because she actually reviewed the file instead of clicking through signatures blindly. The next morning, I walked into Darren's office holding the corrected packet. This can't happen again, I said. Darren barely looked up from his laptop. It was a learning opportunity. No, I said. It was regulatory exposure. He sighed like I was exhausting. You need to make room for emerging leadership. Emerging leadership. Interesting phrase. Especially when used to describe a man who once asked me if FDA Form 483 was basically like a customer satisfaction survey. I stared at Darren for 3 full seconds after he said that. Then I realized Ethan was serious. He actually thought that. For context, a 483 is what FDA investigators issue when they identify potentially significant compliance violations. In pharmaceutical manufacturing, receiving one is somewhere between a financial disaster and a public execution. But Ethan kept climbing. New office. New authority. New meetings. 8 months into his career at Norvale, Darren announced Ethan would streamline oversight functions by consolidating portions of compliance leadership. That was corporate language for something ugly. Monica texted me during the meeting. He's replacing you slowly. I already knew. The official conversation happened on a Thursday at 4:16 p.m. Of course it was Thursday. Corporate cowardice always prefers late afternoons before weekends. Darren's assistant scheduled the meeting under the subject line Organizational Transition Discussion, which translated roughly to Human Resources Wants Witnesses. Conference room Aspen sat on the fourth floor overlooking the parking lot. Cold lighting. Artificial lemon smell from the cleaning staff. One wall-mounted screen displaying the Norvale logo like a courtroom seal. When I walked in, HR was already seated. Linda Greer from Human Resources. Darren. Ethan. And a cardboard box. That detail almost made me laugh. Not because it hurt, because it was so aggressively predictable. Ethan avoided eye contact initially. Darren didn't. He had rehearsed this. Claire, he began, folding his hands carefully. After extensive review of operational redundancies, we've decided to restructure the compliance division. Operational redundancies. 17 years reduced to vocabulary. Linda slid a folder toward me without speaking. Severance agreement. 12 weeks. I didn't touch it. Darren continued. This isn't performance related. Obviously, I said. Ethan shifted slightly in his chair. Darren pressed on. The company is moving toward a leaner compliance model with integrated strategic oversight. There were those fake words again. I looked at Ethan. What exactly does that mean? He straightened immediately, eager to participate. It means we're creating a more agile validation ecosystem. I nodded once. Of course you are. He smiled uncertainly, not realizing I was insulting him. Linda cleared her throat. Your termination becomes effective immediately. Today will be your final day on site. Outside the conference room, somebody rolled a cart down the hallway. The wheels rattled against uneven tile. I remember that sound clearly. Funny what sticks in your head. Not the firing itself. The cart wheels. Darren finally glanced away from me for the first time. We appreciate your years of service. That part irritated me slightly. Not emotionally. Linguistically. People only say years of service when they're discussing employees like retired appliances. I folded my hands in my lap. Who assumes master validation oversight tomorrow? Tiny silence. Ethan answered first. I'll be leading the inspection coordination. There it was. The actual reason. Not cost optimization. Not restructuring. The CEO's nephew wanted the title attached to a successful FDA inspection. And Darren wanted to hand it to him. I looked directly at Ethan then. Really looked. His suit sleeves were slightly too long. He had a fresh manicure. And there was a bright silver Montblanc pen clipped carefully inside his jacket pocket that had probably never signed anything more consequential than a lunch receipt. You scheduled this the day before the audit, I said. Darren shifted again. Timing wasn't ideal. No, I agreed. It wasn't. Nobody spoke after that. Linda kept staring at the severance folder. Ethan stared at the wall monitor. Darren watched me carefully, waiting for emotion. That's the thing people misunderstand about calm women. They assume absence of drama means absence of damage. I stood slowly and took the folder. Understood, I said. That seemed to unsettle Darren more than anger would have. You'll have until 6 to collect personal items. I won't need that long. As I reached the door, Ethan finally spoke again. We've already reviewed system continuity procedures. I turned back slightly. Have you? He nodded too fast. Absolutely. I almost warned him. That's the strange part. For half a second, I genuinely considered helping. Then I remembered the cardboard box sitting beside Linda's chair. So I just said, good luck tomorrow, and walked out. Nobody followed me. Back in my office, I packed exactly 4 things. A framed picture of my daughter graduating Cornell. My coffee mug. A navy cardigan I kept for cold conference rooms. And the fountain pen my husband bought me after my first successful FDA inspection in 2011. Everything else stayed. The binder stayed too. That mattered. What they didn't know was that I had spent the previous 14 months preparing for the possibility of leaving. Not dramatically. Quietly. Competent women in corporations learn eventually that survival depends on documentation. In March of the previous year, after Darren bypassed 2 senior compliance managers to hire Ethan into leadership meetings, I started paying attention differently. I noticed which approvals required my credential chain specifically. Which external auditors contacted me directly instead of using department channels. Which vendors bypassed procurement because they trusted my judgment more than the company's purchasing process. So I started organizing. Not sabotaging. Never that. I documented every active validation dependency across all 3 facilities. I updated procedural ownership records. I archived communication trails regarding unresolved deviations Ethan kept postponing because they created negative optics. Most importantly, I separated institutional knowledge from corporate assumptions. There's a difference. Companies think systems run because software exists. They don't. Systems run because somebody understands why every exception exists underneath the software. For MVRS, that somebody was me. Back in 2017, after the contractor breach exposed partially redacted manufacturing data, I redesigned the access hierarchy personally with outside counsel and FDA consultation. The final structure required master-level custodial authorization tied to licensed compliance leadership. 1 active credential. Mine. Not because I wanted power. Because Darren approved a staffing freeze and refused secondary certification costs. I actually warned him about this during budget review. Twice. I still had the emails. Without master authorization, users could retrieve routine documentation but not locked historical validation chains. And FDA investigators love historical validation chains, especially during biologics inspections. The timing made everything worse. Norvale's audit that Friday wasn't random. It was a targeted surveillance inspection connected to expanded production approvals for their autoimmune therapy line. The company stood to secure contracts worth approximately $480 million over 5 years if the inspection succeeded cleanly, which meant investigators would absolutely request legacy validation records, which meant Ethan would eventually discover he couldn't retrieve them. Not eventually, actually. Almost immediately. Thursday night, after leaving the office, I stopped at my favorite Thai restaurant and ordered basil chicken and iced tea. The hostess recognized me. "Long day?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Bad one." I considered that. Then smiled slightly. Educational. At 9:14 p.m., Monica texted me. "Did they seriously lock you out already?" I looked at the message for a minute before responding. Probably standard procedure. 3 dots appeared instantly. Claire. Ethan just asked where Annex C historicals are stored. I laughed quietly in the restaurant. Not loudly. Just once. Annex C housed archived sterilization validations from legacy manufacturing lines. Access required cross-index retrieval through MVRS master pathways. In simpler terms, the records existed, but only if you knew how to find them properly. I typed back. "I'm sure he'll figure it out." Monica sent one reply. "Oh my God." Then nothing else. At 6:03 a.m. Friday morning, Darren emailed my personal account. Subject line, "Quick clarification needed." Not apology. Not request. Clarification. The email contained exactly 1 sentence. "Can you advise where the investigator accessible validation archive credentials are located?" I didn't answer. At 7:11 a.m., he called the first time. I let it ring. At 7:26, he called again. Voicemail this time. "Claire, call me immediately. This is urgent." By 7:42, he sounded like a man standing in the wreckage of his own decisions. Which brings us back to the parking lot. "Claire," Darren said again, lower now, trying a different tone. "The investigators requested full historical validation pulls for Line 4 biologics expansion." "Yes," I said. "They usually do. We can't access the master archive." "No," I said. "You can't." I heard paper shuffling violently on his end of the line. "We need the retrieval pathway. You terminated the custodian authorization holder 12 hours before a federal inspection." "Claire, you said the system continuity procedures were covered." Another voice cut in behind him. "Ethan this time. We don't need commentary right now. We need access." Interesting choice of words from a man locked out of his own audit. I leaned against the brick wall outside the coffee shop. What exactly did the investigators ask for? Darren answered too quickly. "Historical sterilization validations for Line 4. That's all." Silence. Then he admitted it. and the environmental excursion records from 2021. Of course. The 2021 excursion investigation involved 3 overlapping remediation pathways and a temporary manufacturing hold. Every document chain inside that archive required contextual cross-reference approvals to avoid incomplete retrievals. In simpler terms, if they pulled the wrong file sequence, it would look like Norvale ignored contamination risks, which they hadn't. But proving that required knowing how the records connected. And Ethan didn't. Claire, Darren said carefully now, can you come in for a few hours? I smiled slightly. There it was. The beginning. My consulting rate is $750 per hour, I said. 10-hour minimum. Paid up front. Dead silence. Then Ethan exploded somewhere in the background. She's extorting the company. No, I said calmly. I'm invoicing expertise. Darren lowered his voice immediately. Fine. Plus transportation reimbursement. Claire. And temporary indemnification coverage while I'm on site. Another pause. Fine. I checked my watch. I'll email the contract. Then I hung up. The coffee shop barista handed me my drink as my phone buzzed again almost instantly. Monica. Please tell me that was Darren. I typed back. Parking lot negotiation. Very cinematic. 3 dots appeared. They're dying in there. I believed her. When I arrived at Norvale 46 minutes later, the atmosphere had changed completely. Not chaotic. Worse. Controlled panic. People moved too fast while pretending not to. Conversations stopped when elevators opened. Managers who normally ignored operations staff were suddenly hovering near conference rooms trying to look involved. The FDA investigators had already entered the building. 2 of them. That detail mattered. 1 investigator means routine inspection. 2 usually means depth. Darren met me in the 4th floor lobby personally. First time in years. His tie was crooked. Small detail. But Darren Holt's ties were never crooked. Thank you for coming, he said immediately. You approved the wire transfer? Yes. Good. We walked toward conference room Aspen together. Same room where they fired me less than 18 hours earlier. That amused me more than it should have. Halfway down the hall, Ethan appeared carrying 3 binders against his chest like unstable groceries. He stopped when he saw me. For a second, genuine relief crossed his face. Then resentment covered it immediately after. You could have just answered the email, he said. I looked at him. You could have just not fired me. Darren closed his eyes briefly. The investigators were already seated when we entered Aspen. 1 older woman named Patricia Keene. 1 younger man named David Lynn. Neither smiled. FDA investigators never do during inspections. People think that's intimidation. It isn't. It's efficiency. Patricia glanced at me immediately. And you are? Claire Bennett, I said. Former Senior Director of Regulatory Compliance. Former. Interesting word in that room. Patricia's expression shifted almost invisibly. You designed the validation custody architecture? Yes. She looked directly at Darren then. And she was terminated yesterday? Nobody answered fast enough. That was answer enough. I watched Patricia write something down. Very slowly. You learn to fear slow writing in regulatory environments. The audit lasted 11 hours. I saved them repeatedly. Not theatrically. Quietly. I corrected incomplete retrieval pathways before investigators noticed missing dependencies. I explained legacy remediation chains Ethan couldn't interpret. I reconstructed documentation logic from memory when cross-index reports failed because somebody had improperly altered retrieval permissions trying to bypass my credential structure. That somebody was Ethan. Obviously. Around 2:15 p.m., Patricia asked him directly about a discrepancy in calibration dating. Ethan launched into a 6-minute speech involving agile quality synchronization. Every sentence made things worse. Finally, Patricia interrupted him. Sir, she said flatly, I'm asking whether the calibration was performed before release authorization. Ethan blinked. Then looked at me. Not subtly either. Actually looked at me for help in front of federal investigators. I folded my hands. Patricia noticed that too. No, she asked again. Ethan swallowed. I would need to verify. It says verified here, Patricia replied, tapping the report. Silence. Then Omar spoke from the back of the room. It was completed prior to release authorization. The secondary timestamp reflects archive migration, not execution timing. Patricia nodded once. Thank you. She never looked at Ethan again for the rest of the meeting. By the end of that first day, Norvale avoided formal findings. Barely. When I left the building at 7:18 p.m., Darren followed me into the parking garage. Claire. I turned. We may need additional support Monday. You definitely will. He hesitated. I appreciate your professionalism today. That word again. Professionalism. Corporate language for, thank you for cleaning up the mess we created. I'll send an updated invoice, I said. Then I got into my car and drove home. By the end of the second week, the problem had spread far beyond the inspection. That's the thing about competence gaps in regulated industries. The damage never stays contained. Once people realize the person holding everything together is gone, pressure starts leaking everywhere at once. First came manufacturing delays. The Line 2 validation queue fell behind by 9 days because Ethan approved sequencing changes without understanding equipment dependency timing. Production stalled across 2 injectable products worth approximately $4.3 million in weekly distribution revenue. Then procurement got hit. Turns out several external vendors had maintained unofficial communication pipelines through me because I actually answered emails and understood contract language. Without those relationships, reagent shipments started arriving incomplete. One supplier in Maryland delayed a temperature-sensitive delivery because Ethan forgot to renew a compliance rider attached to their storage agreement. 48 hours later, 12 pallets of material expired in quarantine. Cost to the company, $870,000. Darren stopped sleeping around then. You could see it in his face. The worst moment happened during a board review presentation 17 days after they fired me. Monica told me about it afterward over dinner. Apparently, Ethan insisted on presenting the post-audit stabilization plan himself. He arrived with a 90-slide deck full of meaningless diagrams and phrases like proactive synergy alignment. Half the executive board attended remotely. The CEO attended in person, including Ethan's uncle. According to Monica, the presentation collapsed 14 minutes in when one board member asked a very simple question. Why, she asked, does our remediation schedule show validation completion dates that already passed last week? Ethan tried to answer, then contradicted his own timeline twice in under 60 seconds. Then accidentally displayed an internal tracking sheet showing 37 overdue deviations leadership believed were already resolved. 37. Several tied directly to products under active review. Monica said the room went completely silent. Then the CEO asked, very quietly, who prepared this data? And Ethan said the worst possible thing. Claire usually handled the compliance formatting. Formatting. 17 years reduced to formatting. The board meeting ended early. 3 days later, Norvale lost a hospital network contract in Ohio worth $62 million over 4 years. Not because of a failed inspection. Because the client stopped trusting leadership stability. Their procurement director told Darren directly that the company appeared operationally disorganized. That phrase spread through the executive floor like smoke. Operationally disorganized. The irony was painful. For 17 years, my entire career existed specifically to prevent those 2 words from ever applying to Norvale. Then came the warning letter. Not a formal FDA enforcement action. Worse, in some ways. A preliminary notice requiring expanded documentation review tied to unresolved deviation closures. Translation: the investigators had noticed enough inconsistency to keep looking. Darren called me at 9:40 p.m. the night that letter arrived. Claire, he said immediately, we need to discuss a permanent arrangement. I was sitting on my patio with my husband eating takeout sushi. Permanent sounds expensive, I said. We're prepared to be flexible. How flexible? Silence. Then, executive compensation flexible. That almost made me laugh. Almost. 3 weeks earlier they'd eliminated my position to reduce costs. Now they were negotiating from the edge of a regulatory cliff. What exactly are you offering? I asked. We can restore your previous role immediately. No. Pause. We can discuss expanded authority. No. Darren exhaled sharply. Claire, what do you want? I looked across the patio at my husband. For the first time in years, I'd eaten dinner at home 6 nights in a row. Interesting how quickly your nervous system notices peace once it finally experiences it. I want not to report to people who mistake competence for inconvenience, I said. Then I hung up. The next morning Monica called before 8 o'clock. You broke him. I doubt that. No, seriously. Darren's spiraling. What happened? He tried running the remediation meeting himself. I waited. Monica laughed once. He called a deviation escalation matrix a mitigation triangle. I closed my eyes briefly. That's not even close. I know. By week 5, senior leadership got directly involved. Not Darren anymore. The board. That changes the temperature immediately inside corporations. Executives posture. Boards calculate. Different species entirely. I received a formal dinner invitation from the CEO himself. Richard Mercer. Ethan's uncle. We met at a quiet steakhouse in Princeton on a Tuesday evening. Richard arrived alone. Another detail that mattered. No lawyers. No HR. No Darren. Just the man who finally realized his nephew had detonated half the company's operational credibility. Richard looked older than I remembered. Not physically. Just tired. After the waiter left, he folded his hands carefully. I made a mistake, he said. Direct. No corporate phrasing. That surprised me. Yes, I agreed. A tiny smile crossed his face. You always were brutally concise. I'm efficient. He nodded once. Then he slid a folder across the table. Inside was a proposal. Chief Compliance and Operational Integrity Officer. New executive role. Base compensation, $640,000 annually. Performance equity. Independent reporting authority directly to the Board Compliance Committee. I read the entire thing slowly while Richard waited. They're desperate, I said finally. Yes. And Ethan. Richard looked toward the window for a moment before answering. He won't oversee technical operations anymore. Careful wording. Family protection still mattered. Just less than survival now. I closed the folder. My answer is still no. That got his attention. Richard leaned back slightly. May I ask why? Because you still think this is about salary. Silence. Then he understood. Actually understood. You want structural authority. I want insulation from interference. He nodded slowly. What would that require? That conversation lasted 2 hours. I came prepared. Of course I did. I outlined every condition clearly. Not emotionally. Operationally. First, full executive authority over compliance, validation, and audit response with no override authority from non-technical leadership. Second, all terminated or sidelined compliance staff restored with salary increases and retention protections. Monica specifically promoted to Vice President of Quality Systems. Omar moved into senior validation strategy leadership. Both deserved it years earlier. Third, a formal governance report documenting the exact sequence of failures following my termination, including decision accountability and procedural breakdowns. That condition stopped Richard cold. That report would become discoverable, he said carefully. Yes, it could expose the company legally. It could protect the company operationally. He studied me for several seconds. You're asking for documented accountability. I'm asking for institutional memory. That landed harder. Because he knew I was right. Companies repeat disasters they refuse to document honestly. Finally, fourth, no return as employee under Darren's chain of command. Ever. Richard nodded immediately at that one. Too quickly, honestly. Which told me more than he intended. When dinner ended, he stood beside the table. If we agree to everything, he asked quietly, will you come back? I considered the question seriously. Not because I missed the stress. Because I missed the people who had carried it with me. Monica. Omar. The junior analysts working 12-hour shifts trying to hold collapsing systems together while executives played succession games. Yes, I said finally. Under the right structure. The paperwork took 6 days. The governance report clause caused the biggest fight internally. Darren resisted it aggressively. Ethan apparently called it punitive optics, which sounded exactly like something Ethan would say while accidentally destroying another department. But the board overruled them both. Because by then the financial damage had crossed $94 million between delayed production, lost contracts, emergency remediation costs, consulting expenditures, and suspended expansion timelines. Suddenly accountability sounded affordable. I returned on a Monday morning at 6:40 a.m. Same building. Different power structure entirely. The security guard at the front desk blinked when he saw me, then smiled immediately. "Welcome back, Miss Bennett. Not Claire anymore." Interesting. When the elevator opened on 4, Monica was already waiting near Aspen holding 2 coffees. "You took your time," she said. "You negotiated a raise," I replied. She laughed, then hugged me quickly before either of us could make it awkward. The floor felt different. Lighter. People stopped pretending not to look relieved. One analyst actually whispered, "Thank God," when I walked past, which honestly did wonders for my ego. At 7 o'clock sharp, I entered the executive remediation meeting. Darren stood when I walked in automatically. That surprised both of us. Ethan was there too. Smaller somehow. Not physically. Energetically. He avoided eye contact completely. I took the seat at the head of the table. Nobody questioned it. Then I opened the meeting. "Here's what happens next," I said. And for the first time in months, nobody interrupted me. We rebuilt everything over the next 6 months. Properly this time. Monica transformed quality systems into the most efficient operational review division in the company. Omar redesigned validation sequencing protocols that reduced release delays by 41%. I implemented mandatory technical competency reviews for executive oversight roles. That policy became known internally as the Ethan Rule. Unofficially, obviously. Officially, it was called Operational Qualification Governance. Less catchy. We also separated compliance authority from family relationships. Again, unofficial wording, but effective. Every major regulatory decision now required documented technical sign-off from credentialed leadership rather than executive preference. Funny how quickly governance improves once incompetence becomes expensive enough. Financially, Norvale eventually recovered. The total cost of the entire disaster reached approximately $117 million when everything was calculated. A very expensive lesson in underestimating operational knowledge. The company still survived. Stronger, honestly. Because systems finally reflected reality instead of politics. And Ethan? He stayed. That's the part people always find surprising. But corporations rarely exile executive relatives completely. They relocate them quietly. Ethan ended up managing internal branding initiatives and investor event coordination. No regulatory authority. No validation oversight. No operational approvals. Mostly presentations. Which, to be fair, was safer for everyone. The last time I saw him one-on-one was 8 months after my return. We crossed paths near the lobby elevators. He looked uncomfortable immediately. Then he said, I underestimated how complicated everything was. Not an apology exactly, but probably the closest he was capable of. Yes, I said. You did. Then the elevator arrived. And that was enough. Personally, my life changed more than my title did. I stopped answering emails after 8 p.m. I took weekends off unless genuine emergencies existed. My husband and I started taking short trips again. Small things. Breakfast without conference calls. Evenings without audit binders open across the dining room table. One Friday night my daughter visited for dinner and looked around the kitchen before saying, "It's weird seeing you sit down this much." That one stayed with me. Because she wasn't joking. About a year after everything happened, I walked past conference room Aspen and noticed the cleaning staff using lemon disinfectant again. Same sharp artificial smell from the day they fired me. For a second, I could see the whole scene exactly as it happened. The cardboard box. Darren's rehearsed speech. Ethan talking about agile validation ecosystems like a man assembling sentences from corporate refrigerator magnets. And honestly, I'm grateful for it now. Not the humiliation. The clarity. Getting fired the day before that inspection forced everyone to confront something corporations spend enormous energy avoiding. Competence is invisible right up until the moment it disappears. That's why the parking lot call mattered so much. At 7:42 that Friday morning, Darren wasn't calling an employee. He was calling the infrastructure he thought he could replace with confidence and buzzwords. If you've ever been underestimated at work, I hope this story reminds you that quiet preparation always beats loud arrogance. If this resonated, like and subscribe. I share stories like this every week. And remember, the people who truly hold companies together usually aren't the ones talking the most in meetings.